don't watch this video. I mean it. Go outside, have a walk in the park, spend time with your loved ones, do whatever it is that makes you happy, but don't watch this video. Because if you watch this video, I can't promise you'll get through all of this with your sanity intact. You're still here? This is how damage works in Tacticus. Okay, we're going to start what is an unnecessarily detailed deep dive with a bit of an oversimplification. So let's start simple. Every attack has two components, the damage and the number of hits. Simply, the damage dealt, or we're just going to call this DD, is the damage times the number of hits. So for instance, let's take Malgan Ra. Our D1 Malgan Ra has 550 damage and 6 ranged hits, meaning that he does 3,300 ranged damage dealt in total. But it's not that simple. So your enemy has armor. They can use this armor to reduce the amount of damage that you can deal. So instead, damage dealt is the damage minus armor times the number of hits. So again, our D1 Malgan is now shooting at an enemy with 150 armor. He's going to do 550 minus 150 times 6 range damage dealt. That's a total of 2,400 instead. Okay, well let's use an example. Our D1 Malgan is going to take on a D1 Farsight. What happens? Well, Malgan's got 550 damage, but Farsight's armor is 1,224, a lot more. So 550 minus 1224, he does minus 700 damage per hit. He does 0 damage per hit. What happens? Well, this is when something called pierce ratio kicks in. So pierce ratio is a guaranteed minimum that you get on each hit. Pierce ratio is based on the type of damage that you're doing, but there are ways of buffing it, for instance, with Helbricht's active. Now what we're going to do is calculate two numbers. We're first going to look at damage times pierce ratio, then we're going to look at damage minus armor. We're going to take whichever of those is highest, and we're going to times that by the number of hits. Malgan's using heavy round damage, which has a 55% pierce ratio. So going back to our Malgan Farsight matchup, we're going to take the 550 damage per hit. We're going to times that by 55%, that's our pierce ratio, and that's going to get us 303 damage per hit. 303 is larger than negative 700. So in total, Malgan does ranged damage dealt of 1,818 to Farsight. So is that it? We can go home. That's everything. There's no more complexity. Oh god no, there's still so much more to go. So the next aspect we need to factor in is crits and blocks. Crits and blocks are a chance on every attack to either increase the amount of damage through a crit or reduce the amount of damage via a block. Crit and block chance and also value is determined by the items that you're carrying. For example, this is my Forecast's Heavenfall Blade. He gets a 40% crit chance from this and an additional 904 crit damage. Now this stacks with other items, so for instance if I give him a grenade, that's going to do 6% extra crit chance, and I think it's about 300 odd extra crit damage as well. Crits and blocks apply differently. So crits apply narrowly. What I mean by that is they are inside the pierce ratio calculation. So if we crit, this is what our damage dealt looks like. We take the maximum of one of two numbers. We look at damage plus crit damage all times pierce ratio. Then we look at damage plus crit damage minus armor. Whichever of those two is highest, we take the higher one and we times that by the number of hits. That's our damage dealt. Blocks are wide, so they sit outside the pierce ratio calculation. What this means is that they can actually reduce an attack to 0 damage if they're large enough. So this is how that works. If a block takes place, we start again doing our normal pierce ratio calculation, damage times pierce or damage minus armor, look at which is higher. We then take away the block damage from whichever one is higher. Whatever's left over, we times that by the number of hits. Let's go back to our Malgun versus Farsight. We've given them both max legendary gear. I don't want to use mythic gear here because now we're going to start getting into relics and they've got all other kinds of effects. So we're going to keep it simple, just give them max legendary gear. This means Malgun gets 1024 crit damage, Farsight gets 1204 block. We're going to assume that Malgun and Farsight crit/block on every single hit in this attack. What does the damage dealt look like? We start by comparing two numbers. Damage plus crit damage times pierce ratio, and damage plus crit damage minus armor. We look at whichever one's bigger. That in this case turns out to be the pierce ratio calculation, so 1113 damage. We then take away Farsight's block damage, so the 1204. We times the whole thing by the number of hits. Now in this case, because Farsight's block is so high and Malgun's damage per hit relatively low, unfortunately this results to 0 damage dealt if both Malgun crits and Farsight blocks on every single hit. Crits and blocks apply in a chain, not to attacks as a whole. So if you have lots of hits in an attack, you have to crit on the first attack in order to get a chance to crit on the second, in order to get a chance to crit on the third, and so on and so forth. For people like me that enjoyed high school maths perhaps a little too much, what this means actually is that we're looking at a sum to n of a geometric series. So the expected damage that you get as extra from your crits is actually a geometric series with the following parameters. Don't worry, I've done the maths for you. We will look at it in a table in a moment. A small aside that I do need to mention is that some units have multiple crit or block chance sources. If this happens, you effectively get multiple rolls at the dice, if you like, for each source of a crit chance or block chance that you've got, but you can only crit a maximum of one time. So you get to roll the dice multiple times, but you don't get to add your crit damage or take away your block damage more than once. Now, given this setup, how much extra damage should you expect from your crits? What equipment can we equip to maximize that expected damage? I've put that all in a table for you. Now, I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about this, so it's great to have a chance to be able to clarify when you should use different types of equipment. There are, broadly speaking, 3 categories of crit item that you can equip. I've called these guns, swords, and knives. Guns are anything with a crit chance of 35%, swords are anything with a crit chance of 25%, knives 20%. To compensate for this, knives have the highest crit damage, followed by swords, followed by guns. So knives are going to give you fewer crits but bigger crits when they happen. Guns give you more crits but smaller crits when they happen. Swords are somewhere in the middle. Now, if you do the maths, it turns out guns are almost always the best option. I've heard a lot of misinformation out there about this, people saying if you have 1 hit, 2 hits, 3 hits, maybe you should use a knife. Look, here are the numbers, especially if you're using a crit booster like a grenade. It is always better to use a gun rather than a sword or a knife. There is one exception to this. So if you have characters on your team that can boost crit chance, that changes the maths completely, and that tends to favour knives and swords over guns, especially if you can get crit chance up to 100%. It can never go over 100%, but up to 100%. For example, here are the stats for guns, swords, knives with a grenade, plus a legendary howl. So we're using Ragnar's Howl, and that's going to give us a bit of extra crit chance. As we can see here, it's now better if you're a character that only has 1, 2, 3, or 4 hits. It's better to use a knife than a gun. If you're using 5 and 6 in this scenario, it would still be better to use a gun. If we're pushing our crit chance up even higher, so maybe we're double howling by using on She, or we've also got an Athana, that's only going to favour knives and swords more compared to guns. So this is my rule. If you have anything in your team that is boosting crit chance, do the maths, but the chances are swords and knives are going to be a better choice. Otherwise, irrespective of the number of hits your character has got, use a gun. So is this it? Are we done? Can we go home now, go to bed? Oh, sweet summer child, we still have so much left to talk about. So the next aspect we have to incorporate is damage variance. Your base damage is not fixed. There is a random chance of it being up to 20% higher or lower than the base level. This is often called damage variance, or just summarized as damvar. So putting this all together, this is the equation that we get. We start by calculating two numbers. We take damage variance. If we crit, we add our crit damage. We then times that by pierce ratio. Then we take our damage. If we're critting, we add crit damage, and we take away armor. Whichever of those two numbers is bigger, we take that number forwards. If our enemy successfully blocks, we take away the block damage. Then whatever we're left with at the end, that's our damage per hit. We times that by the number of hits. As we've already got this far, let's talk about buffs. I think one reason to care about the nuances of how damage works in Tacticus is that we can understand better which bonuses work better with which characters. So, the first thing we have to understand is the difference between normal and non-normal attacks. Some buffs only apply to normal or only apply to non-normal attacks. You can end up thinking that you're buffing one of your characters, but actually you're not, because the buff doesn't apply to the type of attack that that character's using. The maths works the same in both cases. For normal or non-normal attacks, we're still going to do our pierce ratio, two numbers, get the maximum, take away, block, everything else is the same. It's just the underlying numbers are a little bit different. The general difference between normal and non-normal attacks is if you're using your stat block or if you're using your abilities. If you are doing a normal attack, the attack is relying on your stat block. If it's using your abilities, then it is probably a non-normal attack. As an example, here is Malgan Ra's Harvester of Souls active ability. As you can see, we're being told it deals 2 times, that's the number of hits, 2,380 to 2,976, that's the variance range, heavy round damage. So this active ability is not relying on Malgan Ra's stats. We've got different numbers that we're using for it here, but the process of working out how much damage it does is exactly the same. The next thing we need to know the difference between is 4 different categories of damage buff. Now there are so many different buffers in the game now that the exact nuances of each individual buffer you do need to take a little bit on a case-by-case basis, but I think there are 4 broad categories of buffer that we can put people into. The first of these are buffs to the attack stat. As examples of this, Athana and Calgar both buff the attack of their allies. Now, if it's buffing the attack stat, and only normal attacks rely on your stat block, then this kind of buffer is only going to make a difference for normal attacks. The buff is applied narrowly, so it's inside the whole pierce range calculation. That makes sense because it's buffing the attack stat itself, so it's right at the middle of the equation. The next type of buffer we need to look at are what I call takes or receives buffers. So these are buffers that will typically use the language of take or receive, and it will be talking about an enemy rather than one of your allies. So Eldrion and Trajan are good examples of this. Now, just based on the take or receive wording, this buff applies both to normal and to non-normal attacks. However, lots of characters that have this kind of wording will have an additional restriction that we're only talking about normal or only talking about non-normal attacks. Again, both Eldrion and Trajan are examples of this. Just like buffs to the attack stat, this buff applies narrowly, so it applies inside your pierce ratio calculation. The third type of buff we need to look at are percentage buffs. For instance, the range specialist trait, or Forecast's passive, or the heavy weapon trait. Percentages generally apply wide, typically outside the maximum value. I believe they apply before you apply any blocks to them. This is quite nice because percentages work well with additional buffs in the first two categories. If your Eldryon is adding, let's say, 100 extra damage per hit from Doom, and then you have a 25% damage buff from Heavy Weapon you've not moved, you'll get that extra 25% on Eldryon's buff as well as on your damage stat. The last type of buff we need to look at are the deals additional buffs. This is a little bit of a weird category. So examples of this are Snotflogger's passive. Snot deals additional damage with each of their normal attacks. Pestilan buffs his allies, giving them some deals additional damage on their attacks as well. Now, deals additional will always specify a number of hits and a damage type. What it effectively does is tags a few extra hits onto the end of an attack. Now, this is a little bit weird for a few reasons. First of all, it's a different damage type, so it might be using a different Pierce ratio. Secondly, even though it's part of the same attack, it starts a new crit chain. Lastly, even though it's a different damage type, it's tagged on at the end, it starts a new crit chain, it does not count as its own attack. This makes a difference if you're using somebody like Trajan, who can give buffs to the first non-normal attack that a character makes. Snot's passive would not count as that. Snot only makes one attack, but it's now truncated into two parts, the normal part of the attack and then the passive bonus that's added on the end. If you've got this far in the video, I don't know if I should thank you for the watch time or recommend you for a checkup to make sure your sanity is still intact. But either way, thank you very much. If you like this, great to see you around again. Do hit the subscribe button. As always, have a good one.